A lone woman found two giant Apache brothers dying in her canyon. Now, their people were coming for them, and the law was coming for her. Her choice would either save her ranch or burn it to the ground. The flash flood had scoured the canyon floor, but what Clara May found tangled in the roots of an ancient cottonwood defied the storm's senseless violence. Two Apache men were sprawled on the mud-slicked earth, their bodies battered and still. But these weren't just any men. They were giants, built on a scale that seemed to belong to myth, not the harsh reality of the Arizona territory. The younger one, barely a man, was impossibly tall, his long limbs built of wiry muscle that stretched well over 6.5 feet. The older one was a colossus, close to 7 feet of solid bone and sinew, with shoulders so broad they looked like they could carry the weight of the sky. Clara had seen Apache warriors before, but always from a distance, flashes of motion and menace on a distant ridge. Men this size were the stuff of campfire tales, meant to frighten settlers into staying behind their stockade walls. They were warrior sons of a powerful chief, trained from birth to be living weapons, yet also tasked with the sacred duty of carrying on a legendary bloodline. Such men never traveled without an escort. They never washed up on the shores of a failing, isolated ranch without a war party thundering in their wake. Even in their wretched state, they wore the marks of nobility. Turquoise and silver jewelry adorned their necks, pieces worth more than Clara May's entire herd of scrawny cattle. Dark, sticky blood soaked the younger one's buckskin leggings from a vicious wound on his thigh. The older one's breathing was a ragged, painful rasp, his chest a canvas of deep, brutal bruises. They had been running from something, or someone, powerful enough to overwhelm them and separate them from their kin. Every ounce of frontier wisdom Clara had inherited from her father screamed at her to turn back. Helping Apache was a death sentence. It was the first and last law of this sun-scorched, unforgiving land. But as the larger man's eyes flickered open, they met hers, and in their depths, Clara saw something that shattered every prejudice she'd ever been taught. It wasn't the fury of a savage warrior she saw, but a raw, desperate fear. It was the same hollow terror she felt every morning when she looked at her dusty, barren fields and knew she was powerless to stop her world from dying. He tried to speak, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, but only a single word in his own tongue escaped before his eyes rolled back and consciousness left him. Standing over two fallen giants who could break her in half with one hand, Clara May realized the next few moments would define her. She could be a survivor who walked away, or she could be the biggest fool in the territory and risk everything for a shred of humanity. The choice that would rewrite her future came down to a single heartbeat and two dying men. Clara knelt, her hands shaking as she examined the younger man's leg. The gash was deep, torn by something jagged, splintered rock, maybe, or a broken lance. Even unconscious, his sheer size was breathtaking. His muscled arms were as thick as her own legs, his hands large enough to palm a calf's head. The older one, the true giant, had a stillness about him that terrified her. His chest rose and fell in shallow, inconsistent rhythm. Her small ranch was a lonely speck in a vast wilderness, 20 miles from her nearest neighbor and a full day's ride from the nearest town. Out here, discovery meant a rope. Settlers who aided Apache were seen as traitors, collaborators in a brutal war that offered no quarter. Men and women had been hanged for far less. The giant's breathing hitched, then quieted. Clara had seen enough dying animals to recognize the sound of lungs giving up. He had an hour, maybe two, before the silence became permanent. "Help him," a voice whispered. Clara's head snapped up. The younger one was awake, his dark eyes alert and blazing with a dangerous fire that reminded her these were not helpless victims. They were warriors. "Please," he said again, the word clumsy but clear in broken English. "My brother." Her throat went dry. The word brother struck a chord deep inside her, echoing the memory of her own brother, Thomas, taken by a rattlesnake bite 5 summers ago. She'd been alone ever since. But these two represented a danger far greater than loneliness. They were Apache royalty. Their disappearance would have war parties scouring every inch of this territory, leaving a trail of blood and fire in their search for answers. A dry wind gusted through the canyon, carrying the scent of dust and the faint rumble of distant thunder. Another storm was brewing. If she did nothing, these two men would die right here. Her neighbors might eventually find the bodies and assume she'd fought them off, defending her property. That story would make her a hero in town. It would keep her safe. But as she looked into the young warrior's face, at his high cheekbones, chapped lips, and eyes that held no plea, only a fierce, desperate hope, something inside her broke. This wasn't about settlers and Apache. This was about two human beings bleeding to death in her yard while she stood by, weighing the value of her own skin. "Damn it all to hell," she muttered, forcing her arms under the older giant's shoulders. He was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone that felt heavier than a granite boulder. The younger warrior, whose name she would learn was Nakai, struggled to his feet. He swayed, his face pale with pain, but he was resolute, grabbing his brother's legs to help. Her own 5.5-foot frame felt frail and small next to them. Together, they stumbled toward her small adobe cabin, a 3-person procession of desperation. Every step was an agony. The older brother's weight threatened to crush her, even with Nakai bearing half the load. Behind them, the wind began to howl, kicking up dust devils that danced across the canyon floor. It might have been the storm, or it might have been riders. When they finally reached her cabin, a new problem arose. The doorway, built for a woman of average size, was too narrow to accommodate the giant's broad shoulders. They had to turn him, angling his huge frame through the opening with agonizing care, trying not to worsen his internal injuries. "They are coming," Nakai whispered, his gaze fixed on the northern ridge. His grip on his brother's legs tightened. Kale's men, as if summoned by his words, figures appeared on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the bruised, purple sky. They were riders, moving like a pack of wolves closing in on a wounded deer. Clara slammed the heavy wooden door shut and slid the bolt home, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through a small crack in the shuttered window. 5 Apache warriors sat on their mounts, their figures stark and menacing as they surveyed the valley. Even at this distance, she could see the glint of rifle barrels and the dark streaks of war paint on their faces. "Your brother," she whispered to Nakai, who was now pressing a strip of cloth torn from his own tunic against the giant's chest. "What did he do? Why does this Kale hunt you?" Nakai's jaw clenched. "My brother, Taza, spoke against Kale in council. Kale is chief's son. He wanted to raid the silver transport. Taza said it would break the treaty, bring the bluecoats." The simplicity of it was staggering. A disagreement, an argument over strategy. And for that, these two brothers were marked for death. Clara thought of the countless times she had spoken her mind, argued with neighbors, or defied the town council. She had the freedom to say no. These men, for all their power and size, had no such right. Through the window, she saw the lead warrior raise a hand, pointing directly at her cabin. They had found the trail of blood and dragged earth. "How many cartridges do you have?" Nakai asked, his hand moving to the hilt of a knife tucked in his belt. Clara did a quick mental inventory. 10 rounds for her Winchester, 5 for her father's old Colt. A pittance against 5 hardened warriors who knew this land like the back of their hand. "Not enough," she said, her voice grim. On the floor, Taza's eyes fluttered open. He was delirious with pain, his gaze unfocused. He began speaking to his brother in a rapid, urgent flow of Apache. Nakai's expression grew darker and more confused with every word his brother uttered. "What is he saying?" Clara demanded. "He says, the warriors are not here for us." Nakai replied slowly, his brow furrowed. "He says they are here for you." The statement made no sense. Clara had never harmed an Apache. She kept to her own land, the same parcel her father had bought legally from the government 20 years ago. She knew that meant nothing to the people who had been here for centuries, but she had always been careful, respectful. She minded her own business. "Why me?" she whispered. Nakai studied her, his sharp eyes searching her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Outside, the warriors began to move, their horses picking their way down the treacherous slope with the deadly calm of predators who knew their prey was trapped. 3 moons passed, Nakai said, his voice low. An old woman of our tribe was found wandering in the sun, her water skin empty. She was near death. He paused. Someone left her a full canteen and food. A white woman. The warriors were sent to find this woman, to bring her thanks from our chief, Mongoose. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She remembered. An old, wrinkled woman, her face like a dried apple, huddled in the sparse shade of a mesquite tree. She'd been on her way back from town, her own canteen nearly empty, but she couldn't just ride past. She'd left the water and the last of her dried jerky, never expecting to see the woman again, never telling a soul. The woman was the chief's own aunt, Nakai continued, a spark of understanding dawning in his eyes. Our chief, Mongoose, swore an oath of friendship to the unnamed woman who saved her. But Kale, his son, argued it was a trick. He said no settler could be trusted. These warriors came to test the truth of the story. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, stopping just outside her cabin. Clara felt a wave of dizzying horror. This wasn't just about the two men she was sheltering. This was about a debt of honor she never knew she was owed, and a political feud she had just stumbled into the middle of. A voice called out in Apache, sharp and commanding. Nakai grabbed her arm, his fingers surprisingly gentle. What you do now, he said, his eyes locking with hers, will decide if you are the friend from the story or just another enemy. The door rattled as a heavy fist pounded against it. Then, a voice called out in English, "White woman, we know you are in there. Come out." Clara's hands were slick with sweat as she gripped her rifle. On the floor, Taza had been roused by the noise. With Nakai's help, he was sitting up against the wall, his massive form a looming shadow in the dim cabin. Both brothers were preparing to fight to the death. "If I go out, they might kill me," Clara whispered. "If I stay in, they'll burn the cabin down around us." "They will not burn," Nakai said, his voice firm. "They came to test your spirit, not to start a war." Another voice shouted from outside, younger and more aggressive. "You help men who defied the chief's son. That makes you an enemy of our people." Clara saw the trap instantly. If she admitted to helping Taza and Nakai, she was siding against the powerful son of the chief. If she denied it, she was a liar, and they already knew she was lying. Either way, she was dead. But Nakai's next words offered a sliver of hope. Tell them the truth. Tell them about the old woman. Claim the debt of honor. He was asking her to gamble her life on an act of kindness she performed months ago. He was asking her to bet that Chief Mongoose valued honor more than his own son's ambition. The pounding on the door grew louder. Through the window, Clara saw two of the warriors moving toward her small barn, where her only horse and 2 milk cows were kept. They were out of time. Taking a deep breath, she called through the door, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Clara May. 3 moons ago, I gave water to an old woman in the canyon. I did not ask her name, and she did not ask mine." A sudden, complete silence fell over the yard. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. When the voice came again, it was deeper, more measured. "Show yourself, Clara May. Bring the men with you." Nakai nodded at her, then helped his brother struggle to his feet. Taza swayed precariously, his hand clamped to his bruised ribs, but he stood tall. Together, the 3 of them moved to the door. Clara lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled it open, squinting against the harsh afternoon light. 5 Apache warriors were arrayed in her yard, their faces a fearsome mask of tradition and war paint. But as she met their gaze, she saw something flicker in their expressions. It wasn't hostility. It was confusion, and maybe a sliver of respect. The leader, a weathered man with streaks of gray in his long black hair, looked her up and down. "You are not what we expected," he said, his English slow and deliberate. The old one said the white woman had the spirit of a mountain lion. "You are small." Clara almost laughed. "I'm just a rancher," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I saw someone in need. That's all." The leader's gaze shifted to Taza and Nakai, who stood behind her like twin towers. "These men brought shame to the son of our chief. Why do you shelter them?" The question hung in the hot, dry air. The fate of 3 people rested on her answer. All around her, the warriors waited, their hands never straying far from their weapons. "Because they were in need," she said simply, same as the old woman. The gray-haired warrior held her gaze for a long, unblinking moment. Then, he turned to the others and spoke in a torrent of rapid Apache. The debate was fierce but short. When it was over, the leader turned his horse back to face her. "Our chief, Mongoose, comes with the rising sun," he announced. He will decide if the debt for saving his aunt is great enough to cover the crime of sheltering these men. You will wait. The longest night of Clara May's life had just begun. As the warriors retreated to the ridge to keep watch, she helped Nakai get his brother back inside. Taza's injuries were severe. The bruising on his chest was a dark, ugly purple, and every breath was a battle. Infection was a constant, deadly threat on the frontier. Will he kill me? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper as she cleaned a cut on Taza's arm. Your chief. Mongas is a just man, Nakai replied, his eyes fixed on his brother's still form. But his son, Kale, has many allies. They will say this alliance with the white man who hunts our silver is more important than the lives of two warriors. He paused, his gaze lifting to meet hers. Or the life of one white woman. The cold, brutal logic of it settled in her stomach like a stone. She understood politics. She'd seen in the town council, where alliances shifted like desert sand. Her life was a small price to pay for tribal unity or a profitable treaty. Why did your brother speak out? She asked, nodding toward Taza, who had fallen into a fitful, feverish sleep. Was it worth this? Nakai's expression hardened. Kale's raid would have brought soldiers, not just to his band, but to all of us. Women and children would pay the price for his greed. My brother believes some things are worth dying for. Honor is one of them. They worked in silence after that. The only sounds the ragged whisper of Taza's breathing and the lonely cry of a coyote far out in the darkness. Clara found herself marking the slow passage of time by the shifting stars, wondering if she would see another sunrise. Just after midnight, Taza's fever broke. He stirred, his eyes clearing for the first time. He spoke softly to Nakai and Apache, then his gaze settled on Clara. His eyes were dark and intelligent, filled with a startling clarity. Thank you, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. You show courage. The two brothers shared a look that said otherwise. Other settlers would have put a bullet in our heads, Taza stated, his words slow but precise. They see our faces and see only enemies. You saw men. This makes you different. Different, Nakai echoed, moving to the window to peer out at the silent, watching warriors on the ridge. Perhaps it is why you are still alive. Perhaps that is why our chief will listen to his aunt's story about the woman with the spirit of a lion. Or perhaps he'll decide different is too dangerous to let live, Clara said, the fear she'd been suppressing finally bubbling up in her voice. Anyone would have done the same, Clara replied automatically. The two brothers shared a look that said otherwise. Other settlers would have put a bullet in our heads, Taza stated, his words slow but precise. They see our faces and see only enemies. You saw men. This makes you different. Different, Nakai echoed, moving to the window to peer out at the silent, watching warriors on the ridge. Perhaps it is why you're still alive. Perhaps it is why our chief will listen to his aunt's story about the woman with the spirit of a lion. Or perhaps he'll decide different is too dangerous to let live, Clara said, the fear she'd been suppressing finally bubbling up in her voice. Taza pushed himself up higher against the wall, his immense frame seeming to fill the small cabin. In the flickering lamplight, she saw an intensity in his gaze that had nothing to do with pain or fever. It was a look of profound recognition, as if he were seeing not just a woman who had helped him, but the very core of her character. Nakai and I, he said, his deep voice resonating in the small space, we have watched you tonight. We saw you face down our warriors. We see you are not afraid to stand alone. He leaned forward slightly. You are not like the other white people we have known. The words hung between them, thick with unspoken meaning and a tension that had nothing to do with the danger outside. Clara felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been missing. It was respect. A sudden sound from outside snapped them all to attention. The crunch of boots on gravel. It was too early for the chief, and the warriors on the ridge were silent. Nakai moved to the window, his body going rigid. 3 riders, he whispered, his voice tight with alarm. White men. One wears a star. Clara's blood ran cold. If the town sheriff had found 2 Apache warriors in her cabin, the confrontation with Chief Mongas at dawn would be the last thing she ever had to worry about. A rough voice cut through the night. Clara May, we know you're in there. This is Sheriff Brody. Come on out, nice and slow. Deputy Marshal William Kane stepped into the lamplight, his badge catching the glow like a warning. Behind him, two other lawmen spread out across Ezekiel's yard, their hands resting on their gun belts with practiced ease. "Marsh, we got reports of Apache in this area," Kane announced, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "Tracking party says they headed this direction after attacking the Morrison place." Ezekiel's blood went cold. If the Morrison ranch had been hit, settlers would be screaming for Apache blood. Any Apache found would be shot on sight. No questions asked. Behind him, he sensed Ayana's massive frame tensing in the doorway. Nearly 7 feet of trained warrior ready to fight, if necessary. Even wounded, she was more dangerous than all 3 lawmen combined. Idle remained motionless against the wall, but her giant form coiled with barely contained power despite her injuries. "Haven't seen any Apache," Ezekiel said, stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind him. His body felt small and inadequate, blocking the entrance. Knowing that 2 women, each capable of crushing these men with their bare hands, waited inside, Kane studied him with suspicious eyes. "That's so because there's blood on your porch, Marsh. Fresh blood, and a lot of it." He gestured to one of his men who immediately began examining the dark stains in the dirt. "Cut myself chopping wood." Ezekiel lied smoothly. "Axe slipped on wet wood, caught my arm." "Show me the cut," Kane demanded. Ezekiel's mind raced. He could fake an injury, maybe use his knife to create a fresh wound. But Kane was no fool. A federal marshal would spot the difference between old blood and new, between injury and fabrication. Deputy called the man examining the bloodstains. "This ain't from one person. Different patterns, different amounts. And these footprints," he pointed to impressions in the mud. "These are huge. Bigger than any settler I've seen." Kane's eyes narrowed as he studied the massive footprints that clearly belonged to the giant Apache sisters. "What kind of people you been hosting here?" "Marsh." "Don't know what you mean," Ezekiel replied, but sweat beat on his forehead. Kane drew his pistol. "Step away from that door. We're searching your place." "You got a warrant?" Ezekiel asked, though he knew it didn't matter out here. Federal marshals made their own law, especially when hunting Apache. "Don't need one for Indian killers." Kane replied coldly. "Stand aside." Ezekiel knew he had seconds before they discovered Ayana and Syl. Once that happened, all 3 of them were dead. The giant women for being Apache, him for harboring enemies of the territory. But as Kane stepped toward the door, Ezekiel made a desperate decision. "Wait," he called out. "You're right. There are Apache here. 2 women badly injured. They came seeking help." Kane's gun swung toward him. "You admit to harboring hostiles?" "I admit to helping 2 dying human beings," Ezekiel said firmly. "Same as I do for anyone else." The marshal's face twisted with disgust. "Apache sympathizer. You'll hang for this, Marsh." Behind the door, Ezekiel heard movement. The giant sisters preparing for battle. But before anyone could act, one of Kane's men called out urgently from the ridge. "Marshal riders approaching from the north. Too dark to see how many." Kane spun toward the sound, his weapon forgotten for the moment. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder. "Could be more Apache," Kane muttered, then raised his voice to his men. "Defensive positions. We'll settle with Marsh after we see who's coming." As the lawmen scrambled for cover, Ezekiel realized that reinforcements were arriving. But whether they came as salvation or doom would depend entirely on who rode through the darkness toward his cabin. The sound of hoof-beats grew closer, carrying with it the weight of judgment that would arrive with the dawn. The riders that appeared in the darkness weren't Apache. They were more federal agents, reinforcements that Kane had called for backup. "Marshal Kane," the lead rider called out, dismounting quickly. "We've got orders from the territorial governor. All Apache harbored by settlers are to be brought in for questioning about the Morrison killings." Kane's confidence returned with the additional support. Now, 6 armed lawmen surrounded Ezekiel's property, making resistance impossible. "Search every building," Kane ordered. "Bring out anyone you find." Ezekiel's heart pounded as he realized his confession had doomed them all. Within minutes, Ayana and Idle would be discovered, and all 3 of them would be dead or imprisoned. But Ayana surprised everyone by stepping out of the cabin voluntarily, her massive frame filling the doorway before she emerged into the lamplight. Even hardened marshals stepped back involuntarily. None had ever seen an Apache woman of her size and bearing. She carried herself like royalty, her nearly 7-foot frame moving with deadly grace despite her injuries. "I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Nailish," she announced in clear English. "This man saved my sister's life when she was dying. Apache law protects those who show mercy to our people." Itself followed her sister outside, her own imposing height and muscled frame, making the marshals exchange nervous glances. These weren't ordinary Apache women. They were giants among their people, trained warriors who could kill with their bare hands. Kane raised his rifle toward the sisters. "Apache law doesn't mean anything to federal marshals. You're coming with us." "No," Ayanna said simply, her deep voice carrying absolute authority. "We're not." "You don't have a choice," Kane replied, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Something about these giant women's confidence suggested they knew something he didn't. Ayanna smiled, a cold expression that reminded Ezekiel of her father. "My father comes at sunrise. He will speak for us then. Until sunrise, we remain under protection of blood debt owed to this man." "What blood debt?" Kane demanded. It'll stepped forward, her massive frame casting shadows across the yard. 3 moons ago, White Rancher saved Chief's youngest daughter from drowning. Apache law says life debt must be honored. This man called in debt tonight when he helped us." The marshals exchanged glances. They had heard of Apache blood debts, sacred obligations that even war parties honored. But they had never encountered a situation where a white settler could claim such protection. "That's Indian superstition," Kane said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Federal law supersedes tribal customs." "Does it?" Ayanna asked quietly. "Then explain why territorial governors signed treaty last winter recognizing Apache legal customs and matters involving tribal members." Kane's face went pale. The treaty was real, a political necessity to avoid all-out war. If these women were really Chief Nailish daughters, and if Ezekiel could prove he'd save another daughter, then federal law would be forced to recognize the blood debt until the chief himself could rule on it. "We'll wait until morning," Kane finally said. "But if your father doesn't show, or if his decision doesn't satisfy federal requirements, all 3 of you are coming with us." As the marshals established a perimeter around the property, Ezekiel realized that everything now depended on what Chief Nailish would decide when he arrived with the sun. The giant sisters had bought them one night, but morning would bring judgment that could mean life or death for all of them. Ayanna moved closer to Ezekiel, her imposing presence both protective and comforting. "Father is wise man," she said quietly, "but wisdom sometimes requires difficult choices." Looking at the armed men surrounding his property, Ezekiel understood that Chief Nailish's decision wouldn't just determine their fate. It would set precedent for how Apache and federal law interacted on the frontier. As the long night wore on, all they could do was wait for sunrise and hope that wisdom would prove stronger than politics. When judgment finally came, dawn broke with the sound of approaching horses, exactly as Ayanna had promised. Ezekiel stood in his doorway, exhausted from a sleepless night spent watching federal marshals patrol his property. The giant sisters had maintained their vigil beside him, their imposing frame serving as both protection and reminder of what was at stake. Marshal Kane emerged from behind his makeshift barricade, rifle ready as dust clouds appeared on the northern horizon. "That better be your chief," he called to Ayanna, "because if it's a war party, we'll start shooting." Ayanna straightened to her full, intimidating height, her nearly 7 feet of trained muscle casting a long shadow in the morning light. "My father comes as promised. He will speak Apache law and federal law both." The riders materialized from the dust. Not the massive war party Kane had feared, but Chief Nailish with a carefully chosen group of 5 elders, their faces painted for formal ceremony. They approached slowly, deliberately, every movement calculated to show respect for both Apache tradition and federal authority. Chief Nailish dismounted with the dignity of a man accustomed to command. He was older than Ezekiel had expected, maybe 50 winters, but his body carried the lean strength of a survivor. Most striking were his eyes, intelligent, calculating, and completely unintimidated by the armed marshals surrounding him. "Marshal Kane," the chief said in perfect English, somehow knowing the lawman's name. "You hold my daughters as prisoners. This creates problem between our peoples." Kane stepped forward, his badge catching the morning sunlight. Your daughters murdered settlers of the Morrison place. They're wanted for questioning under federal law. Morrison tried to force himself on my daughters. Chief Nailish replied with dangerous calm. They defended their honor. Apache law justifies their actions. Federal treaty recognizes Apache law in matters involving tribal members. The legal chess match had begun. Ezekiel watched as two experienced negotiators circled each other with words instead of weapons, each seeking advantage through law rather than force. Even if that's true, Kane said, harboring fugitives is a federal crime. This rancher broke the law helping them. Chief Nailish turned his attention to Ezekiel, studying him with intense focus. You are Ezekiel Marsh. 3 moons ago, you saved my youngest daughter from drowning in the creek. Yes, sir. Ezekiel managed, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. For this, Apache law says, I owe you blood debt. Life for life. The chief's voice carried across the yard with absolute authority. But you also saved 2 more of my daughters when they were dying. This makes debt very complicated. Ayanna stepped closer to Ezekiel, her massive frame, both protective and supportive. Chief, she said formally, this man risked everything to help us. He is worthy of Apache respect. Chief Nailish nodded slowly, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew something that made everyone go still. A necklace of carved bone and silver, the kind worn only by Apache family members of the highest rank. 3 lives saved creates obligation beyond simple blood debt, the chief announced, his words carrying the weight of tribal law. Ezekiel Marsh, you have proven yourself worthy of adoption into Apache family. You become my son through deed and honor. Kane's rifle trembled in his hands. You can't just declare American territory as Indian land. The federal government recognizes treaty rights. Chief Nailish interrupted smoothly. Treaty says Apache can adopt members, claim family lands. Your own law protects adopted Apache family members from persecution. The brilliance of the decision struck Ezekiel like lightning. In one move, the chief had solved every problem. Protection for his daughters, legal immunity for Ezekiel, and a way to claim valuable ranch land under federal treaty law. Ezekiel Marsh, Chief Nailish continued. Do you accept adoption? Do you take my daughters as your sisters, my people as your people? Looking at Ayanna and Idil, 2 giant warriors who had trusted him with their lives, Ezekiel realized this was more than legal protection. It was transformation, belonging, and the chance to bridge 2 worlds that had only known war. I accept, he said clearly. Chief Nailish stepped forward and placed the necklace around Ezekiel's neck. The weight of it felt like chains and freedom combined. Kane holstered his weapon with obvious frustration, knowing he had been outmaneuvered completely. This isn't over. There will be federal investigations. Let them come, Chief Nailish said with quiet confidence. Apache law is clear. Federal treaty honors Apache law. My son and daughters are under tribal protection now. But as the chief prepared to leave with his elders, he turned back to Ezekiel with something that might have been amusement in his ancient eyes. Son, he said quietly, tomorrow I return with different decision. Tonight, think carefully about what adoption truly means. The next day, Chief Nailish returned with a decision that would change everything forever. Ezekiel stood in his yard, still wearing the adoption necklace that had made him Apache family, still uncertain what the chief's cryptic words about different decision had meant. Beside him, Ayanna towered in all her 7-foot glory, her massive frame casting shadows across the ground as she watched her father approach with a small group of elders. The months following his adoption had been a revelation. His failing ranch had transformed into a thriving trading post where Apache families came to exchange goods with white settlers under federal treaty protection. The giant sisters had proven invaluable. Its imposing presence and sharp mind for business made negotiations smooth and profitable, while Ayanna's incredible strength helped with construction and heavy labor that would have taken Ezekiel weeks to complete alone. But success came with complications he hadn't anticipated. Every day spent working alongside Ayanna, watching her move with deadly grace despite her towering size, feeling the quiet intelligence behind her dark eyes, had made his feelings for her impossible to ignore. She was his sister by Apache law now, protected by rules that carried death sentences for violation. You struggle with adoption, Idil had observed the day before. Her own 6.5-foot frame making even ordinary conversations feel momentous. Apache law protects family, but some protections become prisons. Now, as Chief Nailish dismounted with ceremonial dignity, Ezekiel wondered if the older man had somehow sensed the impossible situation he created. "My son," the chief began, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "You have honored adoption well. Apache people see your worth, your protection of those who needed shelter." He paused, studying Ezekiel's expression, "But I am old man, and old men sometimes solve one problem while creating another." Ezekiel felt his heart race as the chief's calculating gaze moved between him and Ayanna. "When I made you brother to my daughters," Chief Nailish continued, "I solved problem of law, but I created problem of heart." He gestured to the giant woman standing beside Ezekiel. "Ayanna is warrior trained to fight and lead, but she is also a woman who chooses her own path. Apache law respects such choices." Ayanna stepped forward, her imposing height making even her father look small by comparison. "Chief," she said formally, "I choose to speak." "Speak then, daughter." Her deep voice carried across the yard with absolute clarity. "Brother has shown honor beyond any white man I have known. His heart is true, his courage proven." But she paused, meeting Ezekiel's eyes directly. "My heart sees him not as brother, but as man worthy of different bond." Chief Nailish smiled, the same calculating expression that had terrified federal marshals. "Apache law has solution for this too. Brother who proves himself worthy can be released from family bond by chief's word if other family agrees." He turned to Itzel. "Younger daughter, what say you?" Idil's massive frame straightened to its full impressive height. "I release Ezekiel Marsh from brotherhood. He has earned right to choose his own path." She grinned, her smile transforming her imposing features. "And sister has waited long enough for happiness." "Then I speak final decision," Chief Nailish announced, his voice echoing with authority. "I release Ezekiel Marsh from adoption. He is no longer my son by law." The words hung in the air like smoke. "But if he chooses, he can become my son by marriage, if my giant daughter agrees to have him." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. Apache traditions blended with territorial law, creating a marriage that was legal in both worlds. Federal authorities, still smarting from their earlier legal defeat, could only watch as Ezekiel married into one of the most powerful Apache families in the territory. Idel served as witness, her laughter ringing across the valley as she watched her sister's joy. Standing nearly 7 feet tall in traditional wedding dress, Ayanna was a sight that took every witness's breath away. A giant among women, beautiful and deadly, choosing love over duty. The trading post prospered beyond all expectations. The unusual sight of 2 giant Apache sisters working alongside their new brother-in-law became legend across the territory. Settlers came from hundreds of miles away just to see the women who stood taller than most men and could outwork any 3 ordinary people. Federal investigation ceased entirely when Washington realized the political value of a peaceful trading relationship. The small ranch that had once meant failure became the foundation of a new kind of frontier community where size meant respect and strength served peace. Chief Nailish's truly shocking decision had been revealed. Not just adopting a white settler, but orchestrating an intricate legal chess game that freed his daughter to marry for love while maintaining tribal honor and federal protection. 6 months later, as Ezekiel watched his towering wife direct construction of their expanded home, he realized that some of life's greatest blessings come disguised as impossible complications. The giant Apache sisters had brought him not just love and prosperity, but a place in a world larger than any he had imagined possible. The fragile peace, however, was a rare commodity on the frontier, and the ripples of their success soon spread far beyond the valley. News of the Apache trading post and its giantess proprietors reached the ears of men in distant towns, men for whom peace was merely the quiet between opportunities for profit. One such man was Silas, the Serpent Blackwood, a railroad speculator from St. Louis with a reputation for acquiring land and resources through means that were legal only in the loosest sense of the word. Blackwood arrived one dusty afternoon, not on horseback, but in a polished black buggy that looked laughably out of place against the rugged landscape. He was a man of contrasts. impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, yet with eyes as cold and predatory as a wolf's. He didn't come with guns and threats, but with maps, contracts, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mr. Marsh," Blackwood began, his voice smooth as oiled leather as he surveyed the bustling trading post. "You have built quite the enterprise here, a testament to American ingenuity and native cooperation." Ezekiel, flanked by Idle, who stood with her arms crossed, her sheer size and unspoken warning, was immediately on guard. "We've done all right," he said, his tone neutral. "You've done more than all right," Blackwood purred, unrolling a map on a nearby barrel. "My associates and I are planning a new rail spur through this territory, a direct line to the silver mines in the north. Your trading post," he tapped a manicured finger on the map, precisely where Ezekiel's land was, "is situated on the only viable pass through these mountains." The threat was veiled, but clear. The railroad was coming, and it would either go through his land or crush it. "This land is protected by federal treaty," Ezekiel stated, the adoption necklace a comforting weight against his chest. "It's Apache land now." Blackwood's smile widened. "Treaties, Mr. Marsh, are merely suggestions, temporary agreements. The march of progress, however, is inevitable." He slid a contract across the barrel. "We are prepared to offer you a generous sum for your property, enough to set you up comfortably back east. Far from all this." He gestured vaguely at the Apache families trading nearby. "This is our home." Ayana's voice boomed from behind them. She had approached silently, her nearly 7-foot frame eclipsing the afternoon sun. She stood beside Ezekiel, her hand resting on his shoulder, a gesture of both affection and solidarity. The sight of the two giant sisters, one on either side of the small, impeccably dressed speculator, was a study in contrasts. Blackwood, for the first time, seemed momentarily taken aback. He had heard the stories, but reality was far more imposing. He quickly recovered his composure. "My dear woman, progress waits for no one. This is a matter of national importance. The government will see it that way." "The government also signed a treaty," Ayana said, her voice dangerously calm. "My father, Chief Nailish, will not see his family's land taken." "Chiefs can be persuaded," Blackwood said, a hint of steel in his voice, "just as marshals can be." The name dropped into the conversation like a stone. "You know Marshal Kane?" Ezekiel asked, his hand instinctively moving closer to the Colt holstered at his hip. "Marshal Kane is a practical man," Blackwood replied smoothly. "He understands the importance of order, and he agrees that this unorthodox arrangement you have here is a threat to that order. The next few weeks were a war of attrition fought not with bullets, but with bureaucracy and intimidation. Surveyors, protected by federal marshals, Kane among them, began marking trees at the edge of Ezekiel's property. Legal notices, filled with impenetrable jargon, started arriving from a territorial judge in Blackwood's pocket. The number of settlers coming to the trading post dwindled, scared off by the constant presence of armed lawmen and whispers of an impending conflict. The tension began to fray the edges of their hard-won peace. Ezekiel found himself poring over legal text he barely understood, searching for a loophole, a defense against the relentless tide of progress. Ayana, a warrior born and bred, grew restless. Her instincts screamed for a direct confrontation, a show of force that would send Blackwood and his cronies scurrying back to whatever rock they'd crawled out from under. "We should fight," she said one evening, her huge hands clenched into fists. "Let them see what happens when they threaten our home. And start a war." Ezekiel countered, gesturing to the peaceful Apache campfires dotting the valley. "That's what Blackwood wants. He wants us to be the aggressors, to break the treaty ourselves. Then he can bring in the army and take everything." "There are other ways to fight," Idle interjected, her sharp mind always seeking a different angle. She had been spending more and more time with the elders, listening to their stories, their histories. "Blackwood sees this land as a line on a map. We know its secrets, the old paths, the hidden springs, the places where a railroad cannot go." Her words sparked an idea. The railroad needed a steady supply of water for its steam engines, especially through the arid mountains. The surveyor's maps showed a single large river, which ran through their land. But It'll knew, from the stories of the elders, of other, smaller sources of water, hidden in the canyons, sources that wouldn't appear on any white man's map. The plan was audacious. They would not fight the railroad head-on, but would instead offer an alternative. They would reveal the existence of another pass, miles to the north, one that was steeper and more challenging, but also one that had access to these hidden water sources. It would cost Blackwood more time and money, but it would spare their valley. To do this, they needed proof. They needed to map the pass and its water sources, and they needed to do it without alerting Kane and his marshals. It was a race against time, with the fate of their community hanging in the balance. Ezekiel, with his knowledge of surveying from his father, and Idle, with her sharp intellect and knowledge of the land, would undertake the dangerous task of mapping the northern pass. Ayanna, whose presence was too conspicuous, would remain at the trading post, a visible deterrent to keep Kane and his men from getting too bold. The journey was perilous. The northern pass was a treacherous labyrinth of narrow canyons and sheer rock faces. For 2 weeks, Ezekiel and Idle braved the elements, subsisting on what they could hunt and forage. Idle's strength and agility were astonishing. She navigated the difficult terrain with an ease that left Ezekiel breathless, her massive frame moving with a dancer's grace. In the quiet moments around the campfire, they talked, and Ezekiel came to know Ayanna's sister not just as a brilliant strategist, but as a woman with her own hopes and fears. "You miss her," Idle said one night, her voice soft in the darkness. "My sister. More than I can say," Ezekiel admitted. "She is a force of nature," Idle said with a smile. "Like a thunderstorm, beautiful and terrifying. It takes a brave man not to run from storm." "Or a foolish one," Ezekiel chuckled. They returned with a meticulously drawn map, detailing the new route and the locations of the hidden springs. Their timing was critical. Blackwood had grown impatient. He had arrived at the trading post with Marshal Kane and a dozen armed men, ready to enforce a newly issued eviction notice from his pet judge. They found Ayanna waiting for them in the center of the yard, her arms crossed, her expression unyielding. Chief Nailish stood beside her, flanked by 20 of his best warriors, their faces painted for battle. The air was thick with tension, a single spark away from exploding into violence. "This is your last chance, Marsh," Kane yelled, his hand on his gun. "Leave now, or we'll burn you out." "There's another way," Ezekiel said, stepping forward and holding up the map. He presented it to Blackwood, explaining the alternative route, the guaranteed water supply, the long-term benefits of cooperation over conflict. Blackwood studied the map, his cold eyes calculating the costs, the delays, the potential profits. He was a businessman above all else, and the map represented a viable, if more expensive, alternative. He saw the logic, the numbers. But his pride, and his deal with Kane, were at stake. "A clever trick," Blackwood sneered, "but I have a court order. This land is mine." "The land belongs to the people," Chief Nailish said, his voice ringing with an authority that transcended legal documents. "And we will not leave." The standoff was broken by an unexpected arrival. A lone rider, his horse lathered and breathing hard, galloped into the yard. He wore the uniform of a U.S. Army captain and carried a dispatch case. He handed a sealed envelope to Marshal Kane. As Kane read the document, the color drained from his face. He looked at Blackwood with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "What is it?" Blackwood demanded. "It's from the territorial governor," Kane spat. "Effective immediately, all federal actions regarding the Apache Treaty lands are suspended pending a full investigation. It seems," he glared at Ezekiel, "that someone sent a letter to a few senators in Washington. A letter detailing potential railroad fraud and the abuse of federal authority." Idle smiled. Before she and Ezekiel had left to map the pass, she had spent a night composing a letter, carefully detailing Blackwood's tactics and Kane's complicity. She had given it to a friendly trader, along with a pouch of silver, to ensure it reached the right hands back east. Defeated, Blackwood could only stare at the map in his hands, a symbol of the victory he had so nearly grasped. The railroad would be built, but it would go through the northern pass. His victory would be more costly, his profits diminished. He had been outmaneuvered, not by force of arms, but by intelligence, courage, and a deep understanding of the land he sought to conquer. As Blackwood and his men retreated, the valley erupted in a quiet celebration. It was a victory not of one people over another, but of a community united against a common threat. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the land, Ezekiel stood with Ayanna and Idil, watching the campfires of their people flicker to life. "We have built something special here," Ezekiel said, his arm around his giant wife's waist. "And we will protect it," Ayanna replied, her voice filled with a fierce love for their home, their family, their future. The trading post was more than just a business, more than just a piece of land. It had become a symbol of hope, a testament to the idea that two vastly different cultures could not only coexist, but thrive together. It was a fragile peace in a violent world, but it was their peace, and they had earned it. The giant Apache sisters and the rancher they had saved had, in turn, saved each other, creating a legend that would be whispered in the canyons and across the plains for generations to come. And as Ezekiel looked at the two towering women beside him, he knew that no matter what challenges the future held, they would face them together. For he was no longer just a rancher, but a son of the Apache, a husband to a warrior, and a brother to a strategist. He was home. The victory over Blackwood settled the dust, but stirred the soul of the community. The trading post was secure, a recognized entity protected by treaty and precedent. But a piece of paper signed in a distant city could not erase the lines drawn in the hearts of men. The threat was no longer from the outside world of railroads and marshals, but from within the delicate tapestry of their integrated lives. The dissent was quiet at first. A murmur in the camps, a sideways glance from the younger warriors had been raised on tales of white treachery. At the center of this discontent was Kale, the son of a prominent subchief, the same ambitious warrior whose raid Taza and Nakai had opposed. Kale had seen his influence wane as Chief Nailish's unorthodox decisions proved successful. He saw Ezekiel not as a brother, but as a white interloper, a walking symbol of the dilution of their traditions. He saw the trading post not as a bridge between worlds, but as a Trojan horse. The confrontation came during the autumn harvest, a time of plenty and celebration. A dispute arose over the price of corn. A white settler, new to the area and emboldened by drink, argued that Ezekiel was giving the Apache a better rate. It was a baseless accusation, but Kale seized upon it. "The white man protects his own blood first," Kale declared, his voice ringing through the busy trading post. He stood before Ezekiel, flanked by a half-dozen young warriors, their faces grim. "You wear our necklace, but your skin is white. Your heart is white. You will always favor them over us." Ezekiel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He saw the flicker of doubt in the eyes of some of the Apache traders. Ayanna, who had been overseeing the weighing of goods, moved to his side instantly, a thundercloud gathering on her brow. Her presence was enough to make Kale's followers take a nervous step back. "My husband's heart is true." Ayanna's voice was a low growl. "He has proven it. Do not test his honor, Kale, or you will test mine." "It is not his honor I question, daughter of Nailish," Kale retorted, careful not to disrespect Ayanna directly. "It is his blood. An Apache is born of the people and the land. He was born of our enemies." The standoff was broken by the arrival of Chief Nailish himself. He had been observing from a distance, his wise old eyes missing nothing. He didn't speak to Kale or Ezekiel, but to the crowd. "A branch can be grafted onto an old tree," the chief said, his voice calm and clear. "If it takes root, it becomes part of the tree. It drinks the same water, feels the same sun, and bears the same fruit. Ezekiel Marsh has been grafted to our people by law and by deed." But Kale speaks a hard truth. The branch must still prove it can survive the winter. His gaze finally settled on Ezekiel. "You have proven your courage to our enemies. You have proven your cleverness to the men of paper and ink. But you have not yet proven your spirit to our people. The time has come." That night, in the council circle, Chief Nailish laid out the trial. Ezekiel was to journey, alone, into the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, the most sacred and treacherous peaks in their territory. His task was to find the nest of the golden eagle, a creature believed to carry prayers to the Creator and perform a warrior's rite. It was a vision quest, a spiritual pilgrimage that tested a man's endurance, his connection to the land, and his worthiness in the eyes of the spirits. You will go with nothing but a knife, a water skin, and the clothes you wear, Naelish decreed. You will hunt for your food, and find your path by the stars. You will not return until you have met the spirit of the eagle. Iona immediately stood to protest. Father, he is a rancher, not a mountain hunter. This is a death sentence. Let me go with him. No, Naelish said, his voice gentle but absolute. This is not a journey of a husband and wife. It is the journey of a son. His spirit must walk this path alone. You must trust him, daughter. You must trust our ways. The look that passed between Ezekiel and Iona was filled with 1,000 unspoken words. Fear, love, and a painful understanding. She, the fierce protector, was being asked to stand aside. He, the quiet rancher, was being asked to become a legend. The journey was a crucible. The first few days, Ezekiel was a creature of the lowlands, clumsy and loud. He startled game, lost his footing on the treacherous slopes, and felt the gnawing emptiness of true solitude. The mountains were a harsh and unforgiving world of sharp rock, thin air, and biting wind. He was haunted by Cale's words, the doubt that he was merely a white man playing a part, a fraud who would be exposed by the first true test. He grew thin, his body hardened by the climb, his skin weathered by the sun and wind. But as his physical strength was stripped away, something else began to emerge. He started to see the mountains not as an obstacle, but as a living entity. He learned the rhythm of the winds, the language of the birds, the subtle signs of animal trails. He stopped fighting the land and began to listen to it. He was no longer Ezekiel Marsh, rancher. He was just a man, small and insignificant against the vast, powerful spirit of the wilderness. On the 10th day, weak from hunger and exhaustion, he found it. Perched on a sheer cliff face that seemed to touch the sky was the eagle's nest. He watched from a distance as the magnificent golden eagle soared on the thermal currents, a breathtaking display of freedom and power. The rite, as Naelish had explained it, was to take something from the nest, an egg, a fledgling, to prove he had been there, a symbol of a warrior's dominance. As he began the dangerous final climb to the nest, he saw the mother eagle watching him, her gaze sharp and intelligent. He saw not an animal, but a fellow parent, a protector of a home. To violate that nest, to take a life or a future life, felt like a betrayal of the very connection he had just discovered. It felt like something a conqueror would do, not a son. It felt white. In that moment, he understood. The trial wasn't about proving he could be a warrior like Cale. It was about proving he had the heart of an Apache. He did not climb to the nest. Instead, he sat on a ledge below, a silent, respectful visitor. He waited for hours until, as the sun began to set, the great eagle circled low over his head. A single, perfect golden feather drifted down on the wind, landing gently on the rock beside him. He picked it up. It was all the proof he needed. His return to the village was met with a stunned silence. He was gaunt and weathered, but his eyes held a new light, a quiet confidence that had not been there before. He walked into the center of the camp, where the people had gathered, and faced Cale. He returns empty-handed. Cale jeered. He has failed. He cannot face the eagle. He is a coward. Ezekiel did not respond to the taunt. He walked to Chief Naelish and held out the single golden feather. This is a feather of a coward, Cale spat. A feather found on the ground, not a prize taken by a warrior. I found the nest, Ezekiel said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent gathering. I saw the mother eagle protecting her young. To be a son of the Apache, must I become a thief? Must I bring death to a sacred home to prove I belong in my own? He looked from Cale to the elders. I did not conquer the mountain. I listened to it. And this, he held the feather aloft, was its gift. It is a symbol of respect, not a victory. A murmur went through the crowd. Iona and Idle moved to stand beside him, their faces shining with pride. Chief Naelish rose, his ancient face unreadable. He took the feather from Ezekiel and held it up for all to see. For a generation, the chief said, his voice heavy with meaning, we have fought the white man who comes to take. He takes our land. He takes our water. He takes our lives. He believes victory is conquest. He then turned to Cale. You would have him act as they do? You would have him prove he is one of us by behaving like our worst enemies. He faced the people again. Today, a man with white skin has shown you the heart of an Apache. He did not take. He received. He did not conquer. He respected. He has passed the test, not of the warrior's hand, but of the warrior's spirit. He is my son, not just by law, but now by the will of the mountains and the spirits themselves. The chief's pronouncement was final. Kale, shamed not by anger but by wisdom, lowered his head. The cloud of dissent that had hung over the community had finally, truly broken. In the years that followed, the trading post became more than a legend. It became a home. It was a place where children with dark hair and children with blonde hair learned the same games, where Apache elders shared stories with grizzled prospectors, where the word family was defined not by blood or by skin, but by the bonds of shared hardship and mutual respect. One evening, years later, Ezekiel stood on the porch of his now expanded home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Ayanna came to stand beside him, her towering form a comforting presence, her hand resting on his shoulder. Their children, a son with his mother's height and his father's quiet eyes, and a daughter with her father's hair and her mother's warrior spirit, played in the yard below with Apache and settler children alike. It'll joined them, a content smile on her face. She had become the community's chief negotiator and historian, her sharp mind preserving the past while securing the future. "You are quiet tonight, my husband," Ayanna said, her deep voice soft. "Just thinking," Ezekiel said, looking out at the peaceful valley. "Thinking about that first day, about 2 dying women in my yard and the choice I had to make." "You chose to be a man of courage," It'll said. "No," Ezekiel replied, pulling Ayanna closer. "I just chose to be a man. The courage came from the family I found." The 3 of them stood together, a silent testament to the extraordinary home they had built. A home forged in the heart of the unforgiving frontier, not with guns and fences, but with the radical, revolutionary idea that even the deepest canyons between people could be bridged by a simple act of kindness. A rancher, a warrior, and a strategist, an impossible family who had proven that the strongest walls were not those made of stone or prejudice, but the ones you build around your own heart. And they had torn theirs down for all the world to see. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.